So as you can see, I've handed out a worksheet or a series of worksheets. I want you to know that I wrote a sermon on Tuesday, which I'm not giving today. The sermon was titled Sophie's Choice or Catch-22. And it was essentially a sermon about hostages and the position that Israel has been in. You're more than welcome to read this sermon. You can have it. It's written out. But since the situation in Israel has changed, I set out again yesterday to find material to talk about. And I kept coming back to this text that we have in front of us because I was reading it this morning. It was a piece of text that I had really overlooked much before this morning, or before this week when I started preparing this Dvar Torah, because I had really never taken note of this specific text. And the specific text that I'm referring to is not on this first page. It's actually on the second side. But we'll get to it in just a minute. By way of introduction, I'll say this. I'm reading a wonderful book now called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. You probably read it, right? If you're at all into popular fiction, it's something you have to read. It's been on New York Times bestseller for a while. We're actually going to do a book club about it. I don't remember when. Maybe in December. We're in December. Maybe this month. It's on a calendar somewhere. Go look on the calendar. It's there. It's a wonderful book. It's essentially about two people who fall in love, don't fall in love. They try and fall in love. It's a great book. But the backdrop of it is gaming, video games. I know nothing about video games, and so I learned a tremendous amount about video games, specifically one term in particular, and that is an NPC. An NPC is a non-player character. They're basically backdrop, right? I'd also had heard a wonderful sermon that was given on the high holidays by a colleague of mine about people who win Best Supporting Actor as an incredibly important comment on society about Best Supporting Actor and what does it mean to be a true support for other people. And the overlap between these two concepts is there are people in the world who we often overlook who really play a significant role in our lives. And what's interesting about that is sometimes we think of ourselves as actually that person in our own lives. We often don't give ourselves enough credit to make ourselves the star of our own movies. And sometimes we think of ourselves only as a supporting actor. And I think that's the message that is being found in this morning's Parashat, specifically with regards to a character who we never hear her name up until this morning's Parashat. Now, what's interesting about it, that's why I titled this, And She Has a Name. So if you turn to the flip side, the first side of the first page, you'll see that there are a number of characters in this morning's Parsha that have no name, which only draws our attention to the fact that when we find somebody who up until this point has had no name and now is named, becomes even more significant. It's the contrast, the stark relief of the fact that initially we have people who have no name and now we have someone introduced to us by name that makes it so important. So it says, V'tamat Dvorah meineket Rivka, that Devorah died. She was the nursemaid of Rivka. V'tikaver mitachat lebeit el, tachat ha'alon, vayikra shemo alon bechut. Devorah, Rebecca's nurse, died and was buried under the oak below Bethel. So it was named Alon Bechut. It was named this place of tears. What I love about this text is, as Rashi points out, we have heard of this person before, just not by name. Chapter 27, We see her already, chapter 27, verse 45. Then I will send her to fetch from this. She sent Devorah to Padan Aram. We see her not having a name, now all of a sudden having a name. We don't really know who she is, except that she is described as Meineket Rivka. Meineket Rivka really is a specific term. Meineket is not a nurse so much as someone who nurses. A wet nurse is what we refer to them as. So Rebecca had this wet nurse who helped her in feeding her children. We have another character who was a Meineket. When Tzipporah, we haven't yet, but when when Miriam sends Moses out to in the water, and Pharaoh's daughter saves Moses as a baby, she hires a wet nurse who happens to be Moses' mother. What we see most interestingly about the character of a wet nurse is someone who sustains other people's lives. That's really, she actually provides nourishment for another person, right? And that becomes so significant. It is Ramban, Nachmanides, who points out something remarkable here, and that is she interrupts the story. If you look at the Ramban, which you can see on not page 3, but page 4, what I've done is in page 4, I have given you the full Ramban, but I have pointed out in the red what Ramban's commentary really is. Ramban, Nachmanides, tends to dray on. He's one of the longer commentaries. He just goes on and on and on. And really, you could sum up what Ramban is saying in 1 or 2 sentences. And in fact, if you look in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, from this morning's Torah reading, you'll see that they sum up Ramban even shorter. But I want you to see the original. I don't know what Ramban says. I don't know why this verse has been placed between the verse, and he called the place Beit El, and the following verse, and God appeared to Jacob again. Right? It's interrupting the story. We have a number of locations in the Torah where we have a narrative that functions, and then there's an interruption, and then we get back to the story. We have that, for example, with Tamar. Later we'll see when the story of Tamar interrupts the Joseph narrative. But, and so on and so forth. Why then was this verse concerning, I'm staying in the red, so if you want to follow what I'm saying. Why then was this verse concerning Devorah's death placed in the midst of this subject? The verse alludes to the death of Rebekah, which you should know is not at all ever referenced in the Torah. We don't have a death ceremony for Rebekah the same way we had one for Abraham, the same way we had one for Sarah. All of a sudden, Rebekah gets overlooked for some reason, and this is supposed to allude to Rebekah's death. That's what Ramban is saying. The verse alludes to the death of Rebekah, and therefore Jacob called the name Alon Bechut, that this is the place where I find continuous suffering, continuous tears. And then it finishes, therefore God appeared to him and blessed him in order to comfort him, just as he had done to his father Isaac upon the death of Abraham. What I find interesting about this is it alerts us to a psychological phenomenon. And that is, every time we experience a death, we actually experience every death we have experienced before. For those of you who have had losses in your life, you recall immediately upon that death what you felt like when a previous person who you loved had passed away. And that becomes a significant moment. By association of feeling, we recall the same experience. By association of feeling, we recall the same experience. And we use those as markers in our lives. Was this loss as bad as another loss? Was this joyful moment as joyful as this moment? We do that because that's the way we compartmentalize. It's the way we make order out of moments that seem to be completely chaotic. And that's what's going on here. But what I find most powerful is that Devorah is named. Devorah herself has her own job. It's not to be compared, and here I disagree with Ramban. It's not to be an allusion to the death of Rebekah. It's supposed to stand for Devorah's loss herself. It's supposed to stand for the fact that she represented a person who made a significant contribution in and of herself, and she ought to be named. She ought not be overlooked. She ought not be considered a non-playing character or a supporting role. She herself makes a significant contribution, no less than nurturing life herself. I love when the Torah names people because it says to us they have to have a name. They're not a number. They're not a player to be named later. They are significant in their own right. And the message that this morning's Parashat points out is there can be so much that's going on. And if you look at the first page of my handout, there are major stories that occur in this morning's Parashat. Jacob meeting Esau after 2 decades of fear of that moment. Jacob wrestles with an angel and he walks away wounded from the experience. We see a horrific moment of Dinah being raped. And yet the Torah takes the time to point out there's a person named Devorah. And while there is so much going on the world stage, we have to recognize that each individual of us has something going on in our own lives, our own personal experiences, our own personal losses. And those ought not be minimized. Look, we say it all the time to each other. I know I'm experiencing this, but do you see what other people are experiencing? I know that I've had a loss, but do you see the horrific tragedy going on in Ukraine or in Israel? So I say to you this morning, don't minimize your own personal suffering that's going on. Don't forget about your own personal losses. Devorah is named, and so too your loss has to be named. Your challenges have to be named. Your experiences have to be named. And in that, you become the star of your own movie, not a supporting actor. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
We continue with Musaf, page 184.